when we left off, we established that there are gains from trade and that those gains allow a country to produce outside of its PPF. So through trade, we can go from here to somewhere out here. And so in this lecture, we want to identify what the mechanisms are that allow those gains from trade to materialize. And to do that, we need to define a few terms. So the first one is absolute advantage. And the absolute advantage, or a country has an absolute advantage if they have the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. If you recall from our example last time, we were producing wheat, and the US required 10 hours, 10 labor hours per ton of wheat, and Japan required 25 labor hours per ton of wheat. So, referring to our definition, the producer that uses fewer inputs has an absolute advantage since the US only requires 10 labor hours compared to Japan's 25. We would say that the US has a absolute advantage in wheat production. And we can do the same for computers. So recall the US required 100 hours per computer, and Japan required 825 hours per computer. So in this case, the US also has the absolute advantage. So this raises the question, if the US has an absolute advantage in both wheat and computer production, meaning they can produce both wheat and computers with fewer inputs than Japan, then how do both countries benefit from trade? Right? Intuitively, we would expect that the US should not trade and should be self sufficient, given that they can produce both goods, wheat and computers, more efficiently than Japan. To answer this question, we need to introduce a new concept. But first, I'll motivate this by saying that there's two ways to measure the cost of a good. So one is we can measure the cost of the inputs required, right? And that's what we just did with absolute advantage. So if we're evaluating the cost of a good based on the cost of its inputs, that's absolute advantage. But if you recall, there's another way to measure the cost of a good, which is through its opportunity cost. And this is going to correspond to what we call comparative advantage. And let's define that. We say that a country has a comparative advantage if they have the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. So let's evaluate the opportunity cost, and we know that using these numbers, we get that the opportunity cost of a computer is 10 tons of wheat, or the opportunity cost of wheat is 1/10 of a computer. And in Japan, the opportunity cost of a computer is 5 tons of wheat. So, in terms of wheat, it's cheaper for Japan to produce computers compared to the US, even though the US has a absolute advantage in computer production, right? Because the opportunity cost of a computer is lower in Japan. So the takeaway is just because a country does not have an absolute advantage doesn't mean they can't have a comparative advantage. And if a country can produce all goods more efficiently than a potential trading partner, that doesn't mean that they can't benefit from trading due to the concept of comparative advantage.